In the following episode, we're going to learn how you can organize a competition offline during this pandemic. We're going to look at what kind of precautions you need to take and when it is a sensible thing to do so. But we're also going to look at how we can use everything we've learned about online tournaments and really integrate them with the offline experience so that even if you are organizing an offline event, you still can have people around the world or people who cannot participate due to COVID restrictions, still allow them to be part of what you want to achieve. Now, it's important to add, of course, that the conversations I had were with conveners and not with health experts. So always make sure that you check your local advice from the official government website and follow their health precautions, and do not substitute anything you hear in this podcast with authoritative advice on what to do and what you're allowed to do following both government and health guidelines. Having said that, there are two conversations, one with Przemek from Poland and one with Daniel from New Zealand, on how to make sure that even during a pandemic you can organize activities offline and allow everyone to participate. Przemek, thank you very much for joining us.
Hi there. Thank you for inviting me here.
So you've organized a competition that was physically during the Corona times in the country where you're at, which is Poland. Could you start by describing to me what is the situation in Poland like at the time that you were organizing the competition? Like how many cases were there and what were the measurements in place?
Sure. So we have organized a Polish National Debating Championship at the beginning of September. That has been moved from the initial date in June. So at the time it was supposed to happen, the number of cases was around, I would say, maybe 400, 500 per day. But the restrictions were still in place, and it was, cancelled a few weeks before when even harder restrictions close to a lockdown actually were in place. And paradoxically, when we have moved that competition to September, the situation in regards to cases was pretty much the same. So the number of cases was, still oscillating around 500, 600 per day. But there were no restrictions whatsoever. And that was mainly due to the political climate in Poland that basically pushed the government to relax some of these restrictions. So in a sense of the statistics, I would say that we have organized this competition during the times that were definitely far away from being normal. But in terms of how people felt about the overall pandemic situation at the time in Poland, I would say that was definitely this, period of a few weeks where people started perceiving their life as a bit more normal than it used to be for the past, almost a year right now. And well, this enthusiasm has been something that I suppose we also shared at the time. Sadly, this is not how it looks like right now, but at the time, I think that, the situation was kind of okay in terms of the restrictions because they were almost known. Literally, the only restrictions were the one referring to, all the sanitary procedures, as well as a ban on, major events as football games. But other than that, basically everything seemed to be normal. Sadly, it turned out to be different.
Yeah, so what you're highlighting here is, of course, these events can only take place if there's a certain minimum amount of measures and correspondingly a low amount of cases there. And as you point out as well, that can differ from time to time. So maybe let's start with discussing how you manage to reschedule, because I think a lot of competitions are sort of up in the air as to when they can organize things, because lockdowns might be removed in an intermediate point in the future, but we don't know exactly when, and then they might not be in place for also only an intermediate amount of time, and we don't know when. So how did you manage to schedule this competition in September?
So the rescheduling part was actually a very challenging element of all of that, mostly because of the context of that very competition. So this is, the most important competition in Poland for all university as well as high school debaters. And on the top of that, it was for the very first time organized in my home city, which does not have, long debating traditions. So I would say that both on the part of the organizers as well as on the part of the participants, there was very little buy-in into the idea of, like moving that competition online. And that is something that we have checked through sending, like a Google form where people were able to indicate their availability for like alternative dates, as well as, like their interest in participating in an online competition. Based on that data, we have decided to move it to September, where, like still universities are closed and just in general, like many people are still kind of free. So our decision to reschedule to that particular date was based on the data that we have received from the participants. Sadly, some of them were unable to participate in the competition, both due to the health concerns as well as to like just normal rescheduling troubles. So we have opened the registration once again, and it ended. The competition ended being much smaller than it was supposed to be. But at the end of the day, we were pretty happy with the decision to reschedule. Probably the most difficult element of all of that was that we literally had to do the organizing bit from the scratch. Some of the brands that we were cooperating with, like like the hotel owners, the catering providers, and all of that, closed down during the period between the planned date and the date it happened. So there was a lot of effort that had to be put into that. But I think that the part of asking the participants and actually having a very open circuit discussion about this was probably crucial, because when we were putting that effort once again to organize this competition in September, we knew that basically this is what people expect and that we are going to have these people on the ground. Sadly, I don't think this is how it looks like right now in Europe. In most countries, probably it is impossible to plan for the foreseeable future. So I'm afraid this is not how it's going to look like for many other competition conveners at the moment.
Yeah, and as I can imagine, indeed, competitions like internationally, nationally, they do have the difficulty, and I imagine you need to be quite flexible with dates. We see from other events, for instance, that some running events in the country that I live in, the Netherlands, have decided to say that they have a flexible date that they move forward. That is basically 8 weeks after the lockdown ends, we will start a competition again, and it really does require that flexibility. But once you have been able to set a date, of course, you then need to organize it yourself and make sure that it fits within all the measures to make sure the participants are safe and going to be healthy. So what are the adjustments that you needed to make compared to a pre-COVID tournament to make sure that your participants stayed within the guidelines for remaining healthy and not contracting COVID?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that it makes sense to divide these measures into two types. The first one would be the measures we planned, either because we wanted to or because we just, were sort of forced to comply with the government guidelines. And the second would be the measures that we haven't planned to do, we were not expecting to do, and we found ourselves in need to do. So in terms of the first type, I think that there were plenty of the obvious ones, such as like the mandatory mask in the auditorium and basically in all places where the participants were gathering in greater numbers than like 10 or 5. Like the disinfectant liquids in all rooms, the like all the other sanitary products that are needed to basically like run a competition like this, something that we are by now probably very much used to. We haven't enforced any kind of social distancing, mostly because it wasn't at the time in the government guidelines, but also because it was like literally impossible given the character of the competition, where most of the people already know each other, and like at the time, as I said, the overall atmosphere seemed to be very much relaxed in regards to the coronavirus. So there weren't that many people that were sort of like afraid of the corona at the time. But what I think is actually very important, and I think that these two measures were actually very successful, is that first of all, we have said very explicitly, both in the email communication as well as like in the announcements at the beginning of the competition, that the overall approach of the people should be to always err on the side of caution, which is to say that they should never like give a hand when they're seeing another person, unless they have like an explicit consent for that, or like they know that the other person doesn't bother. So that if someone wants to isolate to a greater extent than the guidelines that we had at the time, there is no problem about that. And the same referred to, you know, like for instance, social events that we had. So we were very clear as to what are going to be the circumstances, what is going to be the venue, is it going to be feasible to actually, you know, like sort of socially distance at the time or not? And if people didn't want to participate in that, we were, you know, like obviously allowing them to act on that information beforehand. Another two things that I think are worth mentioning is that after the competition, we have been sending out the mandatory form for all the participants, both the speakers as well as the judges, the observers, and all of them, to fill it in and report their health conditions and just in general, you know, like any health concerns that they might have, so that once we actually, you know, like where to spot a problem, we would be able to inform all the people in general with some, you know, like general information, as in, you know, like there was a person that sadly now has you know, like the symptoms, but also more specifically the people that were in direct contact with that with that person in question. This is actually something that happened. Thanks God, nobody actually got infected at the time, or actually we do not know for sure about that, but nobody suffered from the coronavirus. But we have used this mechanism. This mechanism was in place, so that was great. But the other thing also worth mentioning is that one of the social events that we have organized was actually organized in like a particularly weird manner, I would say, a year ago, but right now we are probably very much used to that. So most of our participants were sleeping in one building, but all of them had, you know, like different apartments, and some of them were, you know, like scattered all around the city in different apartments. So we have invited people to basically, you know, like create their social bubbles for that one specific night, so that they do not interact with each other that much. Obviously, the break night was for you know, like everyone all together, but also the venue that we have rented was, you know, like kind of big enough to basically accommodate people, you know, like that wanted to socially distance. This is not what happened in you know, like most cases. I want to be very clear about that. As I said, the overall climate at the time was that nobody, you know, like cared that much, but if someone wanted to, that was the opportunity. So these were, I would say, all the most important measures that we plan to have, and you know, like probably a couple of more, as in, you know, like plastic cutlery, no shared stuff, and all of that. But I'm pretty much sure that people are aware of these measures and expect them to be in place. The second type of measures that were enforced on us, I would say, were the measures coming mostly from the venue providers. In that case, it was the university and the two universities. One of them rented to us a campus. The other one rented to us a palace, because actually they own a palace. So it was a final venue. And in both of these places, we have encountered quite a lot of surprising measures that we weren't aware of at the time of, you know, like signing the contracts. So, for instance, in a campus, we had to clean literally, you know, like 200 square meters or maybe more of you know, like of the floor, because they did not have a cleaning company that was basically equipped with knowledge, as well as you know, like prepared to endanger themselves. And this is something that we have not been made aware of. So a team of volunteers literally stayed, you know, like the whole day after the competition, taking care of the venue. And I would say that the other thing that happened that we weren't expecting was also that in the final venue, there was, you know, like mandatory social distancing policy, while you know, like at the time the government guidelines did not strictly enforce that. This was something that the university had. We were also made aware of that. I would say that there were you know, like quite a few small elements that you know, like at the time of the competition turned out to be extremely problematic, and nobody, you know, like told us about them. So overall, I would say that it was mostly stressful, not because of the character of these you know, like measures that we had to take, but mostly because of, you know, like a very short time frame to enforce them.
So you're, from an organization perspective, you were lucky in that you didn't have to deal with the harshest possible version of measures while still allowing events to continue, of course. Do you think that the competition would have been possible if you had to, for instance, maintain strict social distancing guidelines, such as that no single individual would be allowed to be within 1.5 or 2 meters of one another? Or do you think that if you'd had to organize a competition under that circumstances, the in-rounds would not have been possible?
I think it is something that is possible and feasible, and something that you can do when it comes to tournaments that are primarily, like happening for debate reasons rather than social reasons. This is definitely not the case when it comes to major events where people, like long for them for the whole year, and actually debating is only, the competitive side is only one of the basically, like things that are attracting people. The other one is to just see their friends. So I think that we wouldn't have risked actually organizing something like this if like the measures were, if the guidelines were stricter. But I can definitely imagine that happening with a schools competition, for instance, when you can like basically enforce a huge level of discipline. So I suppose this is something that would have been probably possible. What I would say is that when it comes to enforcing social distancing and like generally disinfecting all the rooms, all of these sanitary guidelines, this is all doable, but probably you need to double or maybe triple the team of people that you have organizing that competition. Because as I said, when it turned out that we literally had to clean the whole campus after like over 100 of people, and we had 5 or 6 volunteers to do that, it was actually a nightmare. So I suppose that when it comes to enforcing even stricter guidelines, the more people you have, the better.
That is very fair. And I would imagine what would also possibly help is if you very strictly and try to enforce people to clean after themselves. Although I think conveners the world over have tried for years to get people to do that, and it seems to be one bridge too far in many circumstances. Which probably leads me to my penultimate question, which is surrounding people wishing to follow the rules. Because I think a large amount of conversations that have happened in European societies are that there are quite a few people who are quite hesitant to want to follow the rules or find it very easy to breach certain guidelines, certainly when it comes to distancing. Now, you mentioned that, of course, in Poland back in September, people were relatively lax about the rules. Is that also a threat that you saw common within the debater subset of people? And do you think that it is easy to try and have people adhere to the rule set? Or do you think that that might be a big choking block when you want to organize a competition?
As far as I'm concerned, my advice would be to actually limit the amount of hypocrisy that you can have when it comes to enforcing the guidelines. And that is actually the advice that I would give to the governments all around Europe as well. Because insofar as there are some measures that make sense, and like if you actually strictly enforce them, it is something that is definitely going to limit the number of cases. You cannot like have a cake and eat a cake. So if you organize a competition when you enforce social distancing during the competition, and you basically like make people wear masks, and after that you have a social where people are like drinking beer, smoking cigarettes all close together, then it's not going to be respected, primarily for the reason that like people see hypocrisy, and they see that like the guidelines that you have enforced are meaningless. And I think that while on the one hand, I obviously understand that, because like we are all sort of against the measures that seem to do not make much sense. And probably the past months in Europe, and like all the basically pandemic related knowledge that we have, suggests that sometimes there might be a point in like respecting some guidelines, even though in a couple of hours there might be like some more relaxed situation. So for instance, like while we are all obviously using public transport in all countries of Europe, it doesn't make sense that it would be very wise to like go hitchhiking right now and change cars every other day, and because that would probably still increase the risk, that like increase the risk of infection. So I think that when we have to deal with the situation like the latter, where some of the restrictions are very like strict, while some of them cannot be for some reason, the key would be communication. And I suppose that this is actually like the element that we have failed to deliver in some part as well, because for instance, me and the other organizer were supposed to have tests for coronavirus just right after the competition, and because at the workplace, at the school we work at, we have been tested weekly. So we were sort of, like a bit relaxed in terms of like respecting all the guidelines, because we knew that we are already the most, like threatened people. So it doesn't matter for us that much. We are already going to know, and at the very least, we are, like going to inform the people. And that very behavior was, like definitely sending a signal. Okay, if they don't care, we don't have to care as well. But like that was a very specific situation, and I'm pretty much sure that neither me nor all the other people involved in that very competition, if it was to happen right now, would behave in that way, because like 2 months and everything has changed actually.
That is very fair to see. And then I think you've given me a large amount of advice that's very useful to say, things that you've come across whilst you were holding competition as well, like the fact you needed more volunteers because it is more demanding to say clean, the fact that sometimes venues might have different rules and you may only be able to find it closer to the date, certainly given the haphazard nature of the competition. But is there something else that you would like to give as a final remark, something you'd wish you'd done even better or differently, or something that you felt at the end was unnecessary to try and spend a large amount of time in doing in order to make sure that other conveners can choose which pathway is best for them to organize a competition?
I think that it might make sense to run a closed Q&A session for all the participants before the event. So before the event, we have published, like many different guidelines, and all of them were published publicly on the Facebook event, which means that we were obviously restricted as to, like what is the kind of information that we can share. And the primary focus was actually, like to err on the side of caution in terms of not being fined by the local authorities rather than action from the participants. But we got a number of questions that were, like the things that turned out to be meaningful for some of the participants that we have not included in this, guidelines. So, for instance, probably you wouldn't publish in like on a Facebook event that the venue for your social is actually not that huge as you want it to be, and it is highly unlikely that during the break, that when you have 100 people in one place, there is going to be a possibility of social distancing. But it is definitely something that you can say before the event to all the participants that are interested. So I suppose that obviously with like the limited policing capacity that debate tournaments have, and the kind of information shared in this way would be definitely valuable. And just in general, like if you cannot enforce people to behave in the strictest manner possible, it is definitely great to give a room for people that are like very precautious about their health, which is absolutely fair and understandable, so that they can still participate in the event but opt out of all the like circumstances that they deem to be risky.
Right, that is, I think, all very sensible advice. Thank you very much for giving it to us.
Thank you so much.
We'll now turn to the conversation I had with Daniel Maier-Gant. Daniel Maier-Gant, thank you for taking the time for this interview.
Kia ora, no worries.
So you've recently CA'd the Auckland Rumble, which, apart from being a Pro-Am competition, also affiliated itself as a hybrid competition. Could you briefly explain to me what that means?
Yes, absolutely. So Auckland Rumble is the University of Auckland Debating Society's chief Pro-Am. Ordinarily, it's run all in person, so people from around New Zealand will come and debate. But this year, obviously, with COVID restrictions and flight difficulties and increasing international accessibilities of tournaments, we really wanted to see whether we could have a tournament that still captures the feel of an in-person tournament for the Auckland students or New Zealand students who wanted to attend, while also facilitating people from overseas or from other parts of New Zealand who didn't feel comfortable traveling or were locked out by financial barriers from still being able to take part in the tournament. So just in general, the way in which it operates is essentially it is a online tournament that has significant numbers of competitors competing from a central location like an ordinary in-person tournament. And there are a few logistical things that you have to get around in terms of facilitating the participation of people who are competing entirely online. But logistically, it isn't enormously different just from running an online person or an in-person tournament. Merely requires some changes within the room itself to make sure that people who are judging or are speaking from overseas or from different locations are able to take part smoothly in the debates as they'd ordinarily operate.
That's very interesting. So just to check in terms of the context of New Zealand. So from what I imagine, New Zealand itself doesn't have any restrictions with regards to movement, social distancing, and the like. Merely the only restrictions are that to enter New Zealand, you have to enter a 14-day quarantine. Is that correct?
Yeah, so at current, we're in what's called level 1, and we were the same during Auckland Rumble, where there are essentially very few restrictions. Obviously, we have contact tracing. We took detailed lists of who was participating within the tournament. So if there was any outbreak that needed us to quickly track down people, it could be done. At points, the alert levels will rise in New Zealand when there are cases that have managed to get through quarantine, that shut down particular cities, in which case they'll introduce new restrictions in a graduated way. But at that moment, there was nothing stopping anyone in New Zealand from traveling up to Auckland and taking part in person. No restrictions on the overall room numbers or the number of people that could be gathered. But obviously, I think this has this format or approach to debating has ramifications beyond merely just the COVID era. Obviously, some people might not want to travel across the world simply to take part in a debating tournament. There are financial barriers there. There are barriers to participation that extend beyond simply COVID restrictions. And the reason we actually came up with this idea is because it's quite common for us to practice with people in other parts of New Zealand. New Zealand is a very geographically large country, so it's not quite like driving a couple of hours to a different city to visit people for debating practice. Online has really facilitated that, and often we would have a couple of teams, say Auckland teams, and then have some of our friends from Canterbury debating. So it's really a way to formalize that setup that we pre-existingly used in practice and allow us to build an entire tournament around the concept.
So how was the reception from those who were there physically? I imagine, therefore, still had to engage in some digital meetings, and we've all been talking about things like Zoom fatigue. Did you notice that there was any difference in uptake, or did people respond generally positive towards it?
I think glowing uptake from the in-person people. Of course, we were a little bit benefited from the fact that people just were desperate to see their friends and have an in-person experience. So we had no major complaints from them. Obviously, there are some logistical difficulties, some technical requirements, things that we actually require from the teams and judges, a little bit of flexibility, dexterity with technology to make everything run smoothly. And there were some teething problems with the way that the tournament operated, but we had overwhelmingly a positive response, but particularly from the people in person for whom it was a glorious opportunity to do in-person debating. And what was a mark of success for us is that for people who were debating online, it felt like any other online tournament mostly. And so we're just able to replicate that experience for them.
Could you go in a bit more detail about these teething problems? I imagine for yourself, you've learned from this because you're planning to organize another hybrid competition, but other countries might be interested in this format, either in different stages of the pandemic or going forward post-pandemic for the reasons just outlined.
Yeah, so the major issue, what I would say is actually the difficulty, I think, is overrated. If you can run an in-person tournament and you can run an online tournament, you can definitely run a hybrid tournament. You essentially just have to approach it like an online tournament and have a dedicated online org-com that's doing all the ordinary stuff you do like for an online tournament, organizing Zoom and breakout rooms and dealing with people's tech problems. So those problems don't go away, but they're not exclusive to hybrid tournaments. The big difficulty that requires some dexterity from the teams and judges in a hybrid tournament is echo, because you'll have multiple sound points operating in the same room, multiple mics that have the risk of picking up sound and duplicating that sound and echoing across things. So essentially what you have to develop is a clear well-explained protocol for how people are to use their devices in terms of turning on microphones, turning off microphones, particularly around points of information, which are obviously the only real opportunity in where you have to engage with any sort of time pressure with making sure that the devices, audio setups, and mic setups are set up in a way that you don't get echo. But that was dealt with quite simply, I think, and got better as teams simply got used to dealing with the online aspect of doing in-person debating. So we had all of the different teams bring in their own device. I think the way that most rooms ended up evolving is that the sound from online speakers was played through a single device, say the chair adjudicator's device, if they could get it loud enough for everyone to hear. But if people were of problem hearing, they could plug in their own headphones and listen along to the audio being played off of their laptop in order to keep up with the sound. And we encourage people to have 2 devices per team. So say, for example, have a laptop and a mobile phone, just so that both people could listen to the audio if they wanted to, coming out of their devices without disturbing the other people by having multiple sound systems playing the same stream, which obviously makes it a little bit more difficult to listen along. And then once you figured out that broader logistical setup, it's really just teaching people how to cope with points of information. So obviously when you receive when someone gives a point of information in the room, and you are, say, the chair who has a sound system set up that is displaying what is heard on the call to everyone in the room, you need to turn off your sound while that person is giving their point of information, because obviously everyone in the room can hear the point of information live. And if you leave your sound on, suddenly you'll get an echo with the sound coming through the microphone that the person is using in front of them. That's why each team needs to have their own device, so they have a microphone where they can ask points of information, and then making sure that you don't have that echo going. And then when you have a person in person who is giving their speech, receiving a point of information from the outside, you need to make sure that that person is able to turn off their mic while turning on the microphone for the point of information that is coming across from the online sphere, to avoid exactly the same problem of sound coming through one area, being picked up by a mic on a different device, and then producing that echo. So once you've figured out just the protocol for turning on and turning off mics and turning on and turning off audio sound, depending on who's giving a point of information, whether they're speaking from within the room or without the room, once you've figured that out, it's just incredibly smooth. It operates like any other ordinary debate, and you don't actually really have to worry that much about the tech, because that's all being operated in the background, just like in an ordinary online tournament.
Fascinating. One other thing I mentioned is that, so we've had an interesting side conversation, I think, in debating as to how the style and approach of debating, how people speak, is changed by the online environment. Therefore, of course, if that is true, then people who speak digitally respond differently than people who do physically, and that might even affect judging. As a CA, did you have to take any precaution in that, or did you not notice any big difference at all in the way that you were able to score people?
So obviously we cautioned people to be mindful that they weren't overrating the charisma of people when they were in the same room, weren't giving too much credence that wouldn't equally be offered to people online. But I would just say that the prevalence of online debating and the fact that we're coming into this hybrid tournament from a perspective where online debating has been the norm means that we actually didn't have to worry a huge amount about the competitive balance, which is obviously what I think people's biggest concerns are. If I'm not there in the room, if I'm not able to deal with this in the same way that someone in the room is, maybe I'm at a competitive disadvantage. We didn't see that playing out from any of the tab. Our best speaker was someone who was online. I think best speaker of multiple categories were people who were speaking online. And I think especially in outrounds, when you're able to project the people onto the screen, there isn't necessarily an enormous difference in the way that the audience or the judge perceives it. And then of course you have judges who are online as well. So in that case particularly, there's no advantage to being one of the 2 or 3 in-person teams in the same room, because your judge is perceiving exactly the same experience for an online debater or an in-person debater. We did have a discussion about whether we wanted to move the judges entirely out of the room in every instance to avoid that perception of favoritism to the teams that were in the room with them. We decided in the end, we actually just didn't think this was necessary. The vast majority of judges are tracking your arguments or applying the same standards to those arguments may in fact be less distracted when they're judging someone who's just on a screen in front of them and their face is filling the screen than someone who's debating in person. So we didn't have any particular problems. It wasn't borne out by any problems within the tab. And I think even if you are worried, just a general caution to the judges about not allowing the dominant experience of being in the room with someone to color your perception of the debate mainly cleans up any of the problems. I think the only major other complaint we got about how it affects the competitive dynamics of debating is sometimes online teams felt like they were being ignored for points of information, because obviously if you're in the room offering a point of information, it is way more noticeable, way more difficult to ignore. I think that's difficult to quantify. I think every team to some degree feels ignored when they're not getting their points of information across. I think judges are very capable of recognizing if one team gets a POI and another team doesn't, and penalizing along that. But I would be interested to, if we run a hybrid tournament again, taking some statistics on this, seeing if there is actually a significant lesser accepting of POIs from people online than people who are also in the room. But once again, I think that can be corrected quite easily by as people get better operating the technology, they're more comfortable accepting POIs from online, because of course that requires a little bit more technical dexterity in terms of turning on and turning off microphones, and in terms of making sure that judges are on the lookout for it, making sure that there is a judging disincentive, or at least judges are mindful of the fact that online teams may be disadvantaged in accepting POIs and then judging accordingly. So I think this is a problem with a little bit more information we can understand fully, but once again, won't be something that is enormously difficult to solve once it is recognized as an issue.
So briefly on that POI thing, back in Manchester 2013, the European Championships trialed something called mandatory point of information, where if you hadn't taken any point of information at the 6-minute mark, a judge would correct you and say, you now have to take one. That's not a solution you think is necessary in order to overcome this problem then?
No, because I think the pre-existing dynamic would also operate. If you're worried about an in-person team being favored over an online team, you would merely just accept the in-person team for that ease if there is a barrier there. We didn't have anyone reporting that POIs were being less accepted than online persons. It was more the prioritization of POIs. Some teams felt that they were being ignored. And once again, without any data to back that up, it's quite difficult for me to verify whether or not that's just the claim of a team that's salty that their closing didn't take a POI, which is an ordinary experience regardless of whether you're in person or online, or whether that is something that needs to be specifically addressed. But then again, if tournaments have any concern about that, there's nothing stopping us from flagging it as a potential problem to judges and to teams, and impressing on teams the importance of accepting points of information from online teams and in-person teams, and making sure that flow of information is captured neatly and clearly.
Thank you. Final question then is, so the profile of the digital participants, how many were there? And did they all come then from New Zealand, but on other parts of the country and couldn't travel? Or was there a true global uptake?
Oh, that's actually a very interesting question. I wouldn't be able to tell you the exact statistics, but Auckland has run quite a few online tournaments already. And I don't think we had a significant change between our Aucklanders taking part in Auckland online tournaments relative to other people for this specific tournament. So I don't think it changed anything fundamentally, whether it was all online or whether it was hybrid. And we did, of course, have participants from other parts of New Zealand who simply just couldn't be bothered coming up to Auckland at short notice, but still had a significant amount of people coming from overseas. I think what I really want to highlight there is that the comparison isn't between a hybrid tournament and an ordinary in-person tournament. It is always between a hybrid tournament and an ordinary online tournament. And we didn't see a dramatic shift in the participation profiles. And obviously, time zones are still going to be a bit of a barrier, but New Zealand tournaments, and particularly Auckland tournaments, I think have developed quite a good reputation for being well-run tournaments that have good quality judging. And we do have strong international interest in attending, especially from people in close time zones like Australia and across Asia.
Wonderful. And then you are organizing an upcoming competition following the same model. When will that competition be? And if people are interested, can they still sign up?
Yes, yeah. So obviously, we have like a broad range of tournaments, and our next major tournament is really Auckland's flagship tournament, and that's the Aotearoa Open. Aotearoa being Te Reo Māori, the Māori language for New Zealand, so the New Zealand Open, if you were to transliterate it. And we are also using a hybrid process for that, where any team from overseas who wants to can sign up, and we hope to continue that practice long beyond COVID, because every once in a year we'll have a couple of Australian teams come across the ditch to take part in these tournaments, and they always add something quite like wonderful to those tournaments. And I think it's an enormous shame that we can't tap into, in ordinary circumstances, the enormous variety of talented debaters that exist across Australia and Asia, obviously the time zones that match most clearly and closely to New Zealand. So we want to make sure that they can have a way to participate without having to fly thousands of kilometers to New Zealand in order to go forward. So that's happening early December. I think it's around the 11th, 12th, 13th of December. That'll be a hybrid process, so anyone who wants to can take part from anywhere in the world, and we're still encouraging people to sign up from that. I don't think sign-ups close for another couple of weeks, so they're very welcome to come. I think the thing that makes me most interested in hybrid debating is definitely not that it's merely a solution to the short-term problem of COVID, but will potentially become a model going forward for how large tournaments operate in terms of trying to balance financial interests and accessibility. And I think if you look at, say, for example, what's going to happen with the next Australs or the next Worlds, Korea Worlds, where there's going to be some countries who are capable of traveling and really want a return to that experience of being able to collectivize, while some countries having not reached sufficient vaccination rates and will have to quarantine and not be able to come. Hybrid presents itself, I think, as a model that can best balance that need to make the tournament accessible to lots of people, while still providing the value that gets from having the community coming together and being able to gather.
I think you're exactly right here. And beyond that, of course, there's things like the environmental impact that needs to be taken into account as well.
Yes.
There's just an enormous amount of benefits for people who choose not to travel, because indeed travel brings with them some costs. Thank you very much, Daniel, for your time. And I'm looking forward to see whether any Europeans are deciding to switch their sleep schedule for a few days to take part in what sounds like a fantastic tournament.
It'll be a lot of fun. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much.